let's get to the tariffs, right? Because personal point of reference here, this weekend, my wife and I were just kind of online looking at different websites, and Shein, which is another popular website folks get clothes from in China, they're not telling folks that there's going to be an increase of like 300% on some of these products. So Shein turned into she out of her mind because I'm not buying that at that price, right? So I went somewhere else. But anyway, it was reported earlier here this morning that Amazon would be going ahead to display a little number and letting people know how much the Trump tariffs are going to increase their price when they check out. Just a little bit ago, before we came here on air, we found out that Jeff Bezos came out, released a statement essentially saying it was just an idea. Hey, we're thinking about it, not a done deal just yet, or maybe it won't happen at all. Although now, though, we are still seeing other companies, like I mentioned, Shein, and also Temu now already showing folks what those increased prices will be. So White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt and the U.S. Treasury Secretary reacted to some of that news here today. If you missed any of it, take a quick listen.
This is a hostile and political act by Amazon. Why didn't Amazon do this when the Biden administration hiked inflation to the highest level in 40 years? And I would also add that it's not a surprise because, as Reuters recently wrote, Amazon has partnered with a Chinese propaganda arm. So this is another reason why Americans should buy American. It's another reason why we are onshoring critical supply chains here at home to shore up our own critical supply chain and boost our own manufacturing here.
Is Jeff Bezos still a Trump supporter?
Look, I will not speak to the president's relationships with Jeff Bezos, but I will tell you that this is certainly a hostile and political action by Amazon. And Secretary, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I would also add that the bringing down the terrible Biden inflation has been a priority for the first 100 days of the Trump administration, and President Trump has done a great job of leading that. Since January 20th, interest rates, mortgage rates are down, gasoline and energy prices are down. We're expecting the further decreases.
All right, let's jump into some of this, right? Because I really want to pinpoint a couple things here, and I'm not the expert when it comes to tariffs. So joining me now to discuss this latest back and forth, and when it comes to tariffs, we are joined by Professor Dietrich von Biedenfeld with the University of Houston downtown. Professor, thank you so much for joining me.
Absolutely, good to be here.
Okay, so you heard that statement just now. Do you view this as a political statement, as the White House press secretary mentioned there, from Amazon, or is this simply transparency? Because many folks would tell you a tariff is a tax.
Absolutely, and it is an increase in expense for either the consumer or the business, and the business is going to pass on as many expenses to the consumer as possible to increase that P over L. So when we think about the political aspect, I think it was an effort to sort of diffuse any tension or animosity to the company and deflect it and say, no, this is a government issued tax. In many ways, in the way that if you live in Texas, we do the appraisal district versus property tax rate.
Right.
So there's a little bit of deflection, a little bit of smoke and mirrors where we say who is actually responsible. At the end of the day, the consumer is going to pay more regardless. So there are other companies, particularly Swedish companies, Chinese companies, Taiwanese companies that are trying to be transparent. Many distributors of those products, commodities, are already evidencing that with their sort of supply chain. And so they're saying at these large commercial grade, they're already demonstrating this. But for the actual consumer, when the de minimis exception goes away next week, they're anticipating that by moving that removal this week and saying, hey, next week when these things arrive, because of course there's shipping time, lead times, these things are going to be more expensive for us, and it's not us. Don't be mad at Temu. Don't be mad at Shine. Be mad at your administration.
Now, you just mentioned de minimis exemption. Kind of explain that to folks about what that is a little bit here, because that directly impacts the goods and the shipments that come across the seas.
Absolutely. Typically, goods under $800 have been exempted from certain tariffs because we understand that small businesses and individual consumers bear the brunt of that, and they're not able to offset that expense in the same way as some of these big box retailers, multinational corporations. But at this point, we're saying, no, we're going all out, and if people won't negotiate with the United States, the administration is saying, no, we're removing that exemption, and we're going to enforce this tariff across the board, 25% up to 145%, depending on the country and depending on the commodity or service.
So now if you're a small business or you're a large business, like a business in general, I would imagine some businesses have the ability to switch or change where they manufacture products. Instead of China, maybe they go to Vietnam or something. Are you starting to see some of that with businesses trying to just change where the manufacturing is being done and try to offset some of the impacts of the tariffs?
Absolutely, particularly with car manufacturers, because we know that these are assembled from many, many parts, software components, hardware components, steel, rubber, and all these other accompanying raw materials that go into a vehicle. And we've seen different suppliers and producers moving either to Mexico. So General Motors is looking and saying, okay, we're going to try to do more here. Dodge, Chrysler, Stellantis, those groups are saying maybe we just actually focus on Mexico and do our exports. So we're seeing that, but as you pointed out, the small businesses don't have that luxury. They don't have the market strength to have that negotiating position, and they also don't have the supplier networks to sort of leverage those things. So a lot of these small businesses are going to have the challenge of even trying to negotiate a new supplier, because many of the existing suppliers domestically are already at their capacity or have existing contracts, non-compete agreements,
Right.
and other legal things that would restrict them from working with the small businesses.
And a small business would have been able to use the minimus exemption to kind of, continue to get some of those goods. But with that going away, that's a larger hill for them to a larger issue for them to overcome, right? Is that
Absolutely.
okay? So now, if you're a small business and this is kind of this ongoing tariff issue here, how long are you going to be able to sustain some of this stuff here? Because I feel like ultimately there might be a tipping point for the economy if small businesses are no longer the lifeblood of, our everyday.
Well, we can look at the statistics. Small Business Administration produces quite a bit. The Bureau of Labor and Statistics produces quite a bit of information. So we can look to those sources to see what those lifespan of the average starting company is. And it's not great, particularly restaurants, we know. Anecdotally, we have these statistics that we shoot off that are pretty close to accurate, where we say maybe 50% of the small businesses that start out aren't going to survive 3 years. And so already they're working with very small margins and challenges. And so many of these small businesses are either going to have to discontinue product lines, reduce their offerings, or immediately pass on that cost to consumers, which makes them less competitive with the big box retailers, the Walmarts, the Targets, the Albertsons that say, no, we're not going to accept any increases in prices for our goods because we're not going to pass this on to our consumers either. So they don't have that negotiating power, and so they are already starting to struggle, cancel contracts, or reduce the products offered on their sites.
And one thing the White House press secretary mentioned is the onshoring of goods and services. And I think COVID is a good point of reference for us, right? Because manufacturing some of that stuff we really needed was a bit difficult. So the president at the time had to implement some executive orders to make that happen, some wartime measures to make sure we can ramp up manufacturing. So onshoring is not a bad thing, right? But maybe the follow through might be some of the issue here.
One of the challenges is making sure you have a qualified workforce. We have quite a few federal regulations, and so we're not doing these things in conjunction. And so one of the challenges, of course, of implementing these tariffs before we have the education, training, or removal of certain CDL requirements or licensing requirements for those new employees is saying, who are these qualified workforce people? Do they need 9 months of training before they can do the job? Do they need 12 months of training before I could not go into a manufacturing plant and begin welding tomorrow.
Correct.
Not only for OSHA standards, but also just the quality of my welds would not be good. So there is a little bit of lead time that's been challenged. We are excited about the idea of onshoring, that domestic security, particularly for national security, onshoring, nearshoring. The challenge of looking at that perspective is, of course, as we see the 25% tariffs for Canada and Mexico. We did have some concessions made in the agricultural area earlier this week to ensure that we are protecting crops. So some of those agreements with Mexico are moving forward, but we still have certain challenges. And part of that training, lead time, et cetera, is being demonstrated as China eases some of their reciprocal tariffs or retaliatory tariffs and says, actually, we don't have the quality airline parts. We don't have the technical skills to produce these things. Right. Certain energy sources. So China has actually backed off of some of theirs, working towards the administration's intended plans, not necessarily because they agree, but out of necessity, and saying we don't have the skilled labor or technical expertise to produce these things. We're going to have to exempt them and accept them from the United States anyway.
That is a portion of the conversation that I never even thought about, was the lead time for the skilled workers. Dietrich, thank you so much. We'll be talking with you again. Great conversation, always super informative, and I feel like I walk away with this. Like, next thing you know, I'll be talking tariffs myself because I know what I'm talking about. I appreciate you, man.